So what are the predisposing factors for ulcers in horses? Well, one of them is training and intense exercise. So race horses, and here I'm referring to racetrack, horses are at risk. Show horses, whether it's Western or English events, they're all at risk. Brood mares are at risk. Okay, the action of foaling and raising a foal seems to be a risk factor as well. And endurance horses seem to be at risk based on a few studies. There was one study that scoped horses right after a ride that consisted of horses completing a 30 and a 50-mile ride. And in these horses, 67%, so 2/3, had ulcers at the end of this 30 or 50-mile ride. The other study was published last year that looked at a little bit more intense endurance rides. These were 50 to 100-mile horses, and they scoped them in the off-season, okay, when they weren't racing. And those horses, 48% of them had ulcers in the off-season when they weren't being ridden in endurance competition. Then they scoped them within 2 days of finishing either 50 to 100-mile rides. And that number went up quite a bit. And in that study, it went from the 48% up to 93% of the horses. So very high percentage of these horses. It was only 30 horses, so not a huge study, but both of these studies suggesting that endurance is a risk factor, just like racing is, just like intense showing is for development of ulcers. Then some other things that came out of the research that suggest the diet plays a role in ulcers. Okay, so first of all, frequency of feeding. The less often you feed a horse, the higher probability of ulcers. That's because there's no food and saliva to buffer the acid. Remember I said at the beginning, they're constantly secreting acid because they're meant to be eating all the time. Then we take them and keep them in a stall or paddock and feed them twice a day. So they've got a 10-hour period with no food, no saliva to buffer. Saliva is a very potent buffer of the acid, and the more saliva they produce and swallow, the better buffer they have. So that's one thing, is frequency of feeding. The more frequent you can feed your horses, the less at risk for ulcers they will be. And then also the time spent eating. Again, because that gets back to the amount of saliva that they're ingesting and the duration that their stomach has food to act as a buffer. So horses being fed green grass, pasture, is probably the optimal way because they're constantly grazing. The next best would be feeding a hay diet because they spend more time eating. And then another thing that's been found is alfalfa seems to be protective, and it's thought that the calcium, you guys all know that alfalfa has a very high calcium content relative to other hays, and the high protein in alfalfa may aid in buffering the acid in the horse's stomach. So horses that are getting some alfalfa, maybe that's going to be a protective strategy. Now, we don't recommend complete alfalfa. Why is that? Horses on 100% alfalfa are at risk for enteroliths, particularly Arabians. So we don't want the whole diet. Should be less, definitely less than half the diet. Okay, should be alfalfa. But adding some alfalfa into the diet seems to be protective. The other one that's a little bit controversial is oil. There have been 2 studies. One of them said corn oil helped to heal ulcers. The other one didn't show any difference. So perhaps oils will help to heal ulcers if they're there. So that's another thing. Grain seems to be a risk factor for ulcer formation. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is, you all know horses eat grain a lot quicker than hay. Okay? And the second one is grain, when it's digested, yields what we call VFAs, or volatile fatty acids, and those are acid, okay? And those seem to be another risk factor for ulcer formation. Housing seems to be a risk factor as well. Stalled horses that are stressed may be at risk for increased ulcer formation. So anything that might stress your horse, if you have a very social horse, you take it away from its friends and now you keep it in a barn, that's going to be a risk factor for ulcers. A horse that's being beat up by another horse in a pasture, that horse is going to be at risk. So stress definitely does play a role in ulcers. What are the subtle signs? Well, subtle signs are irritability, okay, maybe a bad attitude. They might be finicky eaters. They might take longer to eat, pick at the feed. They might spend some time at the back of their stall looking unhappy with their head down, okay, kind of cranky. If you have a horse like that that doesn't have a reason to be doing that, that would be something to look for. They might have a rough hair coat. They might not look shiny or in bloom condition. That might be another clinical sign of ulcers. So there are a whole lot of different signs that could be manifestations of ulcers. Another one is suboptimal performance. So if you have a horse that used to be a very top-level endurance horse and now it's getting pulled for metabolic reasons, or it's burning out during rides, that would be something to consider, is could ulcers be playing a role in that decreased performance. The grain hays, because they have a lot of fiber with them, they're not the same as grain, where you're just getting the cereal grains as a meal. So the grain hays seem to be okay, although again, alfalfa in a few studies, alfalfa seems to be the best. So if you can mix a little bit of alfalfa, 20-25% alfalfa in, that may be protective.
How do the electrolytes affect?
Oh, good question. Electrolytes. There's one study that looked at commercial electrolyte given hourly for 8 hours, and that exacerbated the number and severity of ulcers. So we think that the tonicity, the osmolarity, the osmotic load of those electrolytes is irritating to the stomach. There's no study to see if they create ulcers, but they definitely can exacerbate and make them more severe. Because the study looked at horses that already had ulcers, and after the electrolyte period, they had more severe and more numbers of ulcers.
And that could affect their ingestion of feed.
And if it causes horses to delay eating, that could be playing a role. Last question.
Is it okay if you suspect a horse may have ulcers? Is it okay just to treat them before you go to a big competition with UlcerGuard without necessarily getting them scoped to see if some of those symptoms subside?
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to do with this study, is to see if we treat, because a lot of vets prescribe UlcerGuard or GastroGuard a few days before, a few days after the ride on those horses. So that is a reasonable approach that a lot of people do, because a lot of vets don't have the scopes. Some people are far away from a clinic that has scopes, so not everybody can get the scoping. And so some people just try an empiric course and see if it helps the signs.
So say if they don't really have them, but you think they may not, the treatment wouldn't affect
harm the horse.
Harm them anymore.
And again, that's another motivator for our study, is do they cause harm? So as of now, they seem to be quite safe. In all the toxicity studies, they're very, very safe drugs. And there are a lot of thoroughbred racehorses and quarter horse racehorses that live on the preventative dose of UlcerGuard, because there's such, 99% of racing horses have them. So a lot of those horses live on them, and we have not seen any adverse effects. There's a big concern about calcium metabolism, because you need the acidity to help with calcium absorption. So some people are fearful that long-term, meaning months to years of being on these drugs, might weaken the bones and make them at greater risk for fractures, and that needs to be studied. There's one as of yet unpublished recent study that suggests that's not the case. It doesn't mess up calcium. That's one of the reasons we're looking at the calcium levels in this study.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.